You will need wool, a pair of circular knitting needles. Circular knitting needles are great for knitting in the round and making tubey shapes, but they can also be a convenient way to knit flat. One of the main advantages is that if you're knitting a blanket or a large piece of work, the cable between the needles can take the weight of this piece, unlike using straight needles, which get very heavy on your wrists. When knitting flat on circular needles, the best thing to do is to think of them as two separate needles, and try not to get distracted by this length of cable. So start by casting on the number of stitches directed in your pattern. So start with a slip knot and pop that on your left needle. I'm casting on using the knitted cast on technique so that you can see I'm just treating these two needles like two separate normal knitting needles. Once you've cast on and are ready to knit, it's important that you don't join your work in the round. I like to slide all my stitches up onto the left needle, as this way they look more like two regular knitting needles. And if the stitches go all the way around, it can be confusing which way to knit, and in that confusion you may join them in the round. So cast on stitches in your left hand and start knitting the next row. Right needle into the front leg of the first stitch on your left needle and knit normally. You don't have to worry about the stitches twisting, as you aren't joining them, and you can just straighten them up as you go along. And keep knitting until you reach the end of the row. Then switch over so your knitting is back in your left hand. You can scoosh the stitches up again so there's a gap between your needles, and then just keep knitting. If you take a break in your knitting, try to get to the end of the row, because then you can bunch up the stitches and they're less likely to fall off your needles. Then, when you start up again, it's the needle which is still attached to the ball of wool which goes in your left hand when you start the row. The length of cable between the two needles varies, so for this smaller width of knitting, I have a small length, so I don't have to move the knitting too far to get from needle to needle. And for this sweater, I'm using a 100cm cable to hold the stitches, but the size of the needle still corresponds to the weight of wool. So this chunky wool takes an 8mm needle. So that's a quick guide to knitting flat on circular needles, which aside from anything else looks pretty impressive to non-knitters.